The Mucker by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Part 1. Chapter 1. Billy Byrne. Billy Byrne was a product of the streets and alleys of Chicago's Great West Side. From Halsted to Roby, and from Grand Avenue to Lake Street, there was scarce a bartender whom Billy knew not by his first name, and in proportion to their number, which was considerably less, he knew the patrolmen and plain-clothes men equally as well, but not so pleasantly. His kindergarten education had commenced in an alley back of a feed store. Here a gang of older boys and men were wont to congregate at such times as they had naught else to occupy their time, and as the Bridewell was the only place in which they ever held a job for more than a day or two, they had considerable time to devote to congregating. They were pickpockets and second-story men, made and in the making, and all were muckers, ready to insult the first woman who passed, or pick a quarrel with any stranger who did not appear too burly. By night they plied their real vocations. By day they sat in the alley behind the feed store and drank beer from a battered tin pail. The question of labor involved in transporting the pail, empty, to the saloon across the street, and returning it full to the alley back of the feed store was solved by the presence of admiring and envious little boys of the neighborhood who hung, wide-eyed and thrilled, about these heroes of their childish lives. Billy Byrne, at 6, was rushing the can for this noble band, and incidentally picking up his knowledge of life and the rudiments of his education. He gloried in the fact that he was personally acquainted with Eddie Welch, and that with his own ears he had heard Eddie tell the gang how he stuck up a guy on West Lake Street within 50 yards of the 28th Precinct Police Station. The kindergarten period lasted until Billy was 10. Then he commenced swiping brass faucets from vacant buildings and selling them to a fence who ran a junk shop on Lincoln Street near Kinsey. From this man he obtained the hint that graduated him to a higher grade, so that at 12 he was robbing freight cars in the yards along Kinsey Street, and it was about this same time that he commenced to find pleasure in the feel of his fist against the jaw of a fellow man. He had had his boyish scraps with his fellows off and on ever since he could remember, but his first real fight came when he was 12. He had had an altercation with an erstwhile pal over the division of the returns from some freight car booty. The gang was all present, and as words quickly gave place to blows, as they have a habit of doing in certain sections of the West Side, the men and boys formed a rough ring about the contestants. The battle was a long one. The two were rolling about in the dust of the alley quite as often as they were upon their feet exchanging blows. There was nothing fair, nor decent, nor scientific about their methods. They gouged and bit and tore. They used knees and elbows and feet, and but for the timely presence of a brickbat beneath his fingers, at the psychological moment Billy Byrne would have gone down to humiliating defeat. As it was, the other boy went down, and for a week Billy remained hidden by one of the gang pending the report from the hospital. When word came that the patient would live, Billy felt an immense load lifted from his shoulders, for he dreaded arrest and experience with the law that he had learned from childhood to deride and hate. Of course, there was the loss of prestige that would naturally have accrued to him could he have been pointed out as the guy that croaked Sheehan, but there is always a fly in the ointment, and Billy only sighed and came out of his temporary retirement. That battle started Billy to thinking, and the result of that mental activity was a determination to learn to handle his mitts scientifically. People of the West Side do not have hands. They are equipped by nature with mitts and dukes. A few have paws and flippers. He had no opportunity to realize his new dream for several years. But when he was about 17, a neighbor's son surprised his little world by suddenly developing from an unknown teamster into a locally famous lightweight. The young man never had been affiliated with the gang, as his escutcheon was defiled with a record of steady employment, so Billy had known nothing of the sparring lessons his young neighbor had taken, or of the work he had done at the downtown gymnasium of Larry Hillmore. Now it happened that while the new lightweight was unknown to the charmed circle of the gang, Billy knew him fairly well by reason of the proximity of their respective parental backyards, and so when the glamour of pugilistic success haloed the young man, Billy lost no time in basking in the light of reflected glory. He saw much of his new hero all the following winter. He accompanied him to many mills, and on one glorious occasion occupied a position in the coming champion's corner. When the prize fighter toured, Billy continued to hang around Hillmore's place, running errands and doing odd jobs, the while he picked up pugilistic lore and absorbed the spirit of the game, along with the rudiments and finer points of its science almost unconsciously. Then his ambition changed. Once he had longed to shine as a gunman, now he was determined to become a prize fighter. But the old gang still saw much of him, and he was a familiar figure about the saloon corners along Grand Avenue and Lake Street. During this period, Billy neglected the boxcars on Kinsey Street, partially because he felt that he was fitted for more dignified employment, and as well for the fact that the railroad company had doubled the number of watchmen in the yards, but there were times when he felt the old yearning for excitement and adventure. These times were usually coincident with an acute financial depression in Billy's change pocket, and then he would fare forth in the still watches of the night, with a couple of boon companions and roll a souse, or stick up a saloon. It was upon an occasion of this nature that an event occurred which was fated later to change the entire course of Billy Byrne's life. Upon the west side, the older gangs are jealous of the sanctity of their own territory. Outsiders do not trespass with impunity. From Halstead to Roby, and from Lake to Grand lay the broad hunting preserve of Kelly's gang, to which Billy had been almost born, one might say. Kelly owned the feed store back of which the gang had loafed for years, and though himself a respectable businessman, his name had been attached to the pack of hoodlums who held forth at his back door as the easiest means of locating and identifying its motley members. The police and citizenry of this great territory were the natural enemies and prey of Kelly's gang, but as the kings of old protected the deer of their great forests from poachers, so Kelly's gang felt it incumbent upon them to safeguard the lives and property which they considered theirs by divine right. It is doubtful that they thought of the matter in just this way, but the effect was the same. And so it was that as Billy Byrne wended homeward alone in the wee hours of the morning, after emptying the cash drawer of old Schneider's saloon and locking the weeping Schneider in his own icebox, he was deeply grieved and angered to see three rank outsiders from 12th Street beating patrolman Stanley Lasky with his own baton, the while they simultaneously strove to kick in his ribs with their heavy boots. Now Lasky was no friend of Billy Byrne, but the officer had been born and raised in the district and was attached to the 28th Precinct Station on Lake Street near Ashland Avenue, and so was part and parcel of the natural possession of the gang. Billy felt that it was entirely ethical to beat up a cop,